So, right, so let me just begin following Jared. I'd also like to thank the Inter-Humanities for sponsoring the series and their Humanities to Go speaker series. And I'd also like to thank Howe Library, and especially Jared, for inviting me to be with you this evening, even if virtually, to speak on a topic that I think is very important, and I hope you will agree. So my talk today does build on a couple of previous talks I've given in the HTG series. And also more recently, a talk I gave at Arizona State University and a university in Bogota, Colombia. I got some very helpful comments, which I've since incorporated into the talk for tonight. So I'm grateful for those. And just by way of acknowledgement too, I am drawing from some material that's previously published in my textbook, Ethics and Technology, as well as from a few articles, which I'll list at the very end. And just a few remarks by way of overview. As most of you know, we often hear or read about new and emerging technologies almost daily. So we seem to be inundated with that kind of material. I came across an interesting article from the Bank of America, of all people, of all groups, identifying 14 new emerging technologies, including the following that I mentioned here. Most interesting, of course, I think is the metaverse for our purposes. But they didn't address any ethical issues. They were looking at it in terms of maybe of investments where you might want to buy stock. But, for me, these also raise a number of ethical questions, and they're also worth examining. I'm not going to examine any of these technologies tonight. I'm also not going to talk about another one that's very popular right now, that is autonomous vehicles or smart cars. I'm going to focus on two emerging technologies: ambient intelligence and the Internet of Things. I'll say more about them, obviously. I think they're core to many of the broader emerging technologies of the day. And before discussing some of the ethical aspects, I'd like to look at what we mean by concepts like converging technologies, emerging technologies, how these two are interrelated but also different. And I'd also like to describe and propose a kind of an ethical framework that can maybe help us better understand, analyze, and respond to these technologies, and especially their societal impact. So I'd like to begin just with trying to get clear on some definitions. What do we mean by converging technologies and technological convergence? And in the context of computing and technology, I'm going to draw here from some place called Technopedia. Convergence is described as the coming together of two or more different entities, or as the integration of two or more different technologies in a single device or system. The phrase technological convergence has also been used to describe what happens when two or more unrelated technologies or technological paths converge unexpectedly to create an entirely new field. I'll mention a few of those in just a minute. So convergence in the context of digital technology, what I'm going to call cyber technology in this talk, is not new or even a recent phenomenon. I think it's been around for a while. And I think arguably you could claim it's been going on from the outset in the concept of computing. In the earliest computers were the convergence of vacuum tubes and other technologies that happened to be around. And it was in the 1940s and 50s, and beginning with network technologies in the late 60s, that itself was the convergence, really, of standalone computing machines, these mammoth machines that took up an entire room that were just sat idle. And then conjoining those with communications technologies enabled the beginnings of early network computing back in the 60s and 70s. So it's been going on for quite a while. And Howard Rheingold notes that virtual reality technology resulted from the convergence of video technology and computer hardware back in the 1980s. No one anticipated that. It just happened to emerge from the convergence of those two unrelated technologies. It's just one case in point. So first of all, I'm not going to claim that all emerging technologies result from convergence, at least not directly, although many of them, as we'll see, do. So they're separable, but I think they're very interrelated. So I mentioned that some new fields have emerged also because of this convergence. So cyber technologies converge with other non-cyber technologies to create some interesting fields. And if you think about in the area of biology, for example, in genomics, we have bioinformatics, computational biology, computational genomics, brand new fields that emerged because of traditional biology in the wet labs with computational techniques, or the old-fashioned genomics with computational kinds of things. So basically, computational genomics was made possible because of integration of data mining techniques, algorithms that were pattern matching, which really came as a result of AI. And with that technology, scientists were able to model and eventually sequence the human genome without having to do so by hand in the wet lab and physically sequence all the genome. Ironically, that same technology that enabled us to accelerate the sequencing of the human genome in the early 2000s also created privacy issues for research subjects and other kinds of ethical issues that were unanticipated at the time. So if you think about some of the issues that came as a result of that, informed consent with data mining technology, for example, people could be consenting to give their data in ways that would be used that they couldn't anticipate. So it was a kind of a presumed consent versus informed consent. Also, we had the question then, who owns our personal genetic data once it resides in a private database? There's a company in Iceland, for example, called Decode Genetics, where they had developed, they were able to have access to the genetic records of almost the entire population of Iceland. It was good in some ways in terms of trying to deal with disease and population studies. On the other hand, it was kind of frightening in terms of personal privacy and ownership of one's genetic data. Another area, another field that I think resulted from this is something called nano computing. And that resulted from the convergence of cyber technology and nanotechnology. And because of the ethical issues that emerged in that field, we have a field called Nano Ethics, which is sort of developing in response to issues that arise at the intersection of nanotechnology and I'm going to call it applied ethics. So among the ethical, legal, and social controversies involving nanoethics, we have privacy concerns, like I just mentioned, but these are affecting at the nano level scale devices, which are invisible to us. It could be used to track and monitor. Nano level scale weapons could be developed and acquired by terrorists or rogue nations. Something called runaway nanobots in the gray goose scenario. What happens if these nanobots get out of control and they start disassembling matter at the nano level? We could end up with something that the scientists fear that they call the gray goose scenario, which is instead of compiling or assembling new objects, they disassemble matter. So a number of interesting ethical issues arise there. I won't be talking about those. I just mentioned them in passing because of new fields that have developed because of convergence. So two that I will be looking at tonight, two areas are what I'm going to call ambient intelligence and the Internet of Things, and you may be familiar with one or both of these already. So my focus will be on these two relatively new emerging technologies, which I believe are really at the core of many of the latest emerging technologies. So ambient intelligence, what I'm going to call AMI, it's been defined as a technology that enables us to live and work in environments that respond in intelligent ways. And again, AMI was made possible by developments in the field of artificial intelligence, among other technologies. So it itself is a result of technological convergence. It was unexpected in a way that this happened to emerge, and yet we have it. So specifically, I think AMI emerged because of the connection between three key technological components. I'm going to call pervasive computing, ubiquitous communication, and intelligent user interfaces. And I'll say just a few words about each of those. So pervasive computing, according to the Center for Pervasive Computing, is defined as a computing environment where information and communication technology are everywhere for everyone at all times. It's just around us. At one time, it was the case, well, I'm going to go online, or I'm going to go in cyberspace, or I'm going to, but it's right now, it just pervades and surrounds us. Ubiquitous communications, a technology that ensures communications between smart devices is continuous, flexible, and omnipresent. So, I mean, that's just at the core of most everything we do, from our smartphones to most technologies we have right now. A third that made this possible is something called intelligent user interfaces, or IUIs. If you think about traditional interfaces like keyboards and a mouse and a monitor, they were standard for so many years. Before that, I don't know how many of you were old enough to remember punched cards or magnetic tapes and things, or ways of interacting with computers. So when we moved beyond that stage, we had keyboards and mouse and touch computing. But the more recent interfaces are far more intuitive and far more efficient. It requires less effort on our part. And many of these contemporary IUIs, these interfaces, can kind of know and sense far more about us, including information about our situation, context, environment. And that was in a way that wasn't possible in the past. And the other piece of this is that people are often unaware of the existence of these intelligent user interfaces, even though they're surrounded by them, because they're embedded in the very fabric of our technology, or just of our homes and our workplace environments. So another emerging technology which ties in or is based or built upon AMI is something called Internet of Things. I'm going to call IoT, which you probably heard a lot about these days. And that enables humans to interact not just with other humans, but with objects or things, in addition to the typical kinds of websites and devices that are connected to the internet. So on the one hand, say, well, we've been acting with intelligent agents and smart devices for several years now. I mean, that doesn't seem to be all that exciting, all that new. But on the other hand, the idea of smart devices and smart objects communicating with one another, independent of human interaction or oversight, as in the case of IoT, it's still a relatively recent phenomenon. So AMI and IoT have helped make possible smart homes, smart buildings, the current technologies that we have today, which has been a good thing in many ways. But IoT has also enabled users not just to search for information about people or institutions or topics, but actually to search for things like webcams, smart TVs, refrigerators, someone's printer. As long as these devices are plugged in or connected to the internet, search engines like Shodan, for example, a little controversial, enable people to make these kinds of searches, which if your intelligent device, your home refrigerator or washing machine or whatever is hooked up to the web, or your webcam or whatever, people can actually search and get information about you on that. So the kinds of searches we can now do go well beyond the kinds of typical searches that we did in the past using Google, other search engines like that, which used to just index URLs. So if I did a search of, I don't know, James Taylor or something like that, I would get a list of URLs we could go to get information about the person, the musician, history, so on and so forth. Now with Shodan and other kinds of advanced search engines, we can also search for objects or things, which could, if you had a smart home, lead people into search into that environment. So what are some ethical issues generated by ambient intelligence, Internet of Things? That's sort of the heart of what we want to talk about tonight. I'm just going to briefly mention three. There are many, many issues one could talk about. One is freedom and autonomy. One is technological dependency. And a third is privacy, surveillance, and something called the Panopticon, which I'll talk about in detail. So what about autonomy and freedom? And the question right now seems to be, will human autonomy and freedom be enhanced in the future, or will be diminished as a result of these technologies? So proponents and optimists say, well, this is a good thing because we'll gain more control over our environments. Technologies will be more responsive to our needs. So we'll have increased autonomy or increased freedom, convenience. But as Philip Bray, a colleague of mine, has noted, there's sort of a paradox in this reasoning because, as he points out, greater control by us is presumed to be gained through a delegation of control to machines. So we're kind of delegating, absconding our responsibility, giving them more control. And in some ways, we're surrendering control. So it could be that these technologies actually diminish the amount of control that we have over our environments, and thus limiting our autonomy and freedom, contrary to what we think would be the goal of these technologies. Dependency. Well, I mean, you could say we've been dependent on computing technology for a long time. I mean, we've already come to depend cyber technology in ways for everyday lives that if someone were to lose their smartphone, they would just feel totally helpless and naked to the world, right? I mean, we're all painfully aware of that. And I think most of us understand it and at this point could probably still deal with it and recover. But in the future, will we come to depend on these smart technologies in ways that exceed our current dependency on technology in general? What happened if we lose some of our cognitive capacities because of an increased dependency on smart technologies? Is that possible? On the one hand, smart technologies could relieve us of many of our routine and mundane day-to-day tasks, considered tedious and boring. If I could have a smart lawnmower and a smart snowblower, I think I'd be happy. I don't know, maybe I would. On the other hand, the technologies could eliminate much of the cognitive effort that in the past enabled us to sort of feel fulfilled and flourished as humans. And I often tell my students, much to their surprise, that whenever I do many tasks, including my income tax, I always do things by longhand. And of course, they look at me in total shock, like, why would anybody use longhand when you can use a calculator? I thought, I don't want to lose some of those 7th and 8th grade arithmetic or mathematics skills that I learned, which have served me well over the years. And I think if you don't use these, you're going to lose them. So I try to force myself to do some kind of cognitive task. Otherwise, I could just delegate to some kind of a machine. So I often think of a work that was kind of prescient at the time. I don't know if you're familiar with E.M. Forster, a British novelist, literary person who taught at Cambridge back in the early 20th century, wrote a work back in 1909 called The Machine Stops. And it was, I wouldn't say clairvoyant, but boy, he pictured a world in which there was video conferencing like we're doing tonight, where there was a number of technologies, almost in the same way like Jules Verne anticipated technologies in some of his novels. E.M. Forster envisioned this society where we had reached a certain stage of convenience and relaxation. And we had a kind of a global machine, a convenience machine that made our lives remarkably easy. And we became accustomed to living with this, all the perks of that society. But over time, people became detached from the machine. We lost touch with nature. And at one point, the machine begins to break down, but no one knows quite what to do or how to fix it. And they realize what's happening and not quite sure what to do. And I oftentimes think back of just minor episodes. I remember we had when my daughter was probably, I don't know, in 1st grade, we had a snowstorm and we were without power for almost a week. And people were like, how can this be? What will we do? Of course, we got that back. But what would it be like if we became so dependent on a technology that went away permanently? And I thought it gave us, cause for concern. So I advise you reading that work. It's a short story, but very clever and again very prescient. A third ethical concern: privacy, surveillance, and the Panopticon. You could say, well, privacy issues have been around for a while. When computers first came out, people were first aware of them back in the 50s and 60s. There was concern about a national database where information about citizens would be kept by the government, and then later by corporations, et cetera. So we've been worried about that. But I think the privacy, it's not just in terms of scale, it's almost different in kind now. Because of the kinds of concerns we have to worry about with emerging technologies like AMI and IoT. And I'll just mention 4 of those kinds of concerns that a philosopher Leigenreich talks about that make a big difference. One is what they call the ubiquity aspect. The privacy threats are more pervasive in scope because of the ubiquity, the omnipresence of ambient intelligence. It surrounds us. We're not even conscious of it. It's embedded in objects. It can be embedded in walls in smart apartments or smart buildings. A second is the invisibility. As computing technologies have gotten smaller and smaller, at the micro level now, soon approaching the nano level, it's going to be hard to even recognize that the technology is around us. Yet it'll be able to collect information about us and disseminate that information without even being aware of it in any conscious way. A third aspect, I mentioned this back with intelligent user interfaces, is the sensing technologies, that they're becoming so sophisticated now that they're at the point where they're almost able, and soon will be able, to sense human emotions like fear, stress, excitement, and exploit those emotions or their knowledge of the emotions. And the fourth is they're all serious, but maybe the most worrisome, I call memory applications. And this is the potential for a memory log or a life log of everything we've done and it can be recorded indefinitely. So when I think about the world prior to computing, a person could have a blemished past and then move to a different area, start over again. But now anything one does will follow them the rest of their lives because of this memory log. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know, for example, if the academic records from my parents when they were in high school still exist today. I suspect they probably don't. But I know that my daughter's grades from grade school all the way through graduate school will follow her the rest of her life, just because there's an electronic trail. But then what about people who live in smart homes and smart apartments, especially smart apartments where they might know that their conversations are being recorded? That's a little bit frightening. There was a show many years ago on TV called This Is Your Life, and someone would come on and have people from the past come on. And well, now we could all have a show like This Is Your Life, and there would be a trail of everything we did or said. So these are kind of worrisome issues from a privacy point of view. Another question, a concern, is just about surveillance and something I'm going to call something called the Panopticon. So in AMI environments, no one can be sure that he or she is not being observed at any given moment. So it would seem prudent for us, if we're in these environments, to assume that information about us is being recorded, observed and recorded. So in this sense, all of us now are subject to a virtual panopticon, so a term coined by a British philosopher and psychologist, Jeremy Bentham, back in the 18th century. And Bentham's 18th century model of this was something called the inspection house, where he first introduced his notion of a panopticon. And it was an inspection house was a prison environment. And it was a prison in which the cells were all built in a circle. And there was one prison guard who sat at a central desk, and his desk rotated around the prison cells. And the cells were constructed of a glass door in front of each one, where the inspector, the guard, could see in, but the prisoner could not see out. So the prisoner didn't know if at any given moment he or she was being observed by the prison guard. Only the prison guard knew that. And so the question is, well, if you know that you could be observed, is that controlling what you do? Is there something you might be inclined to do that you would not do now because of that fear? And what happens when that becomes extended to the contemporary public places like the workplace or public buildings where you have this kind of panopticon? So will that model be extended to these environments, to private, intimate environments as well, like our smart homes, smart apartments, and so forth? What effects would this have on us in terms of our individual behavior? How would we react if we knew we were being observed every time? Would that be an effective tool for government control, for social control by governments? So I remember thinking back to Singapore, which is one of the first countries to really use IT in both a positive way, I guess, and also in a way to control citizens. So people knew they were being observed at any given point, and it affected social control. People would not, for example, throw chewing gum on the sidewalk because they know they'd be fined $2,000 or thrown in prison or executed or whatever, because there was a kind of big brother observing them at every given moment. So in Bentham's classic Panopticon, a prisoner could not necessarily be certain whether he was actually being monitored at any given point in time. But as critics note today, in AMI environments, we can with almost 100% certainty know that we are being observed because the technology is just built to do that. So before, in Bentham's time, the observations were limited both in time and place to the fact that someone had to be there to do the observing. But data captured in AMI environments cuts across both space and time because there's no human being needed to track and do this. It's recorded through programs, algorithms that are set up to do this automatically. So one might say, well, who cares if I'm observed walking down the street or in the mall or going into a store? On the one hand, most of the data would seem innocuous. I get into debates with my wife about this. Why do you care about, who cares what I'm doing? But the data can also be used and compiled in certain ways to create personal profiles that can be used to make judgments about us for employment, insurance, etc. And we could have that happen to us without our knowledge or awareness. So a question then, for me, it's important. Do we have an adequate ethical framework to handle the kinds of challenges that we're now facing from Internet of Things, from ambient intelligence, and other emerging technologies? Basically, my question is our, I'm going to call standard applied ethics framework sufficiently robust to handle these kinds of problems? So I don't know if any of you ever had courses in philosophy or ethics before, but I'll just talk about what I'm going to call a standard applied ethics framework. People like Philip Bray and others talk about this in their work. But basically, there are three main components that philosophers use. The first is to identify a particular controversial technology or practice as a moral problem. The second is to describe and analyze the clarifying concepts associated with the problem. The third would be to apply moral theories or principles in the deliberative process to try to reach a position about the moral issue. And pick the case of something like euthanasia. Okay, you identify it as a problem, moral problem. But what about it? How do you clarify it? Well, you're talking about active euthanasia, passive euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia. So you need some clarification around that. And then you want to apply moral theories to see, can it be justified, not justified? Well, there are a number of ethical theories. I just happen to mention utilitarianism here, which is probably one of the most popular or common. And that looks at the greatest good for the greatest number. You look at the consequences But there are also non-consequentialist theories that also compete and say, well, no, it's not about the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not simply that crass. You can just do a calculus like Jeremy Bentham had figured out. There's also human dignity and things like that need to be respected. So that's the traditional applied ethics framework that most philosophers, many ethicists use. So the question I'm wondering is that sufficiently adequate in an era of emerging technologies? Can we still just simply apply that model and will it work? So one question we can ask at the beginning is, well, who exactly is impacted by these new and emerging technologies? And the ethical concerns surrounding ambient intelligence, Internet of Things, as well as many other ones, as we saw, affect a diverse range of parties or stakeholders. So it's not just the software engineers and programmers and corporations that design and implement these technologies, but ordinary people like you and me. Virtually everyone is or will be soon be affected by these technologies. So it would seem that all of us would benefit from clear ethical guidelines and policies that address these new and emerging technologies at some points or various points in their development. So again, a need for ethical guidelines for these new and emerging technologies. So typically in the past, ethical analysis was done like after the fact. After new technology is already in place, people start thinking about the ethics. So people like Jim Moore, for example, retired professor at Dartmouth, referred to this kind of as an ethics last approach. You've got the technology, it's here now, what do we do about it? So Jim Moore and John Ruckert note that ethics was typically reactive, in the sense that it follows scientific developments rather than informing scientific research. The technology, the developments were already there. So it had to play catch up because the guidelines were often developed in response to technologies where serious harm had already been done. And because of difficulty associated with this ethics last approach, some have argued more recently for what can be called an ethics first type of strategy. So many of you probably remember the Human Genome Project in its heyday. And when the work began that back in the 1980s, there was a lot of concern about the ethical implications. What would this mean for privacy, et cetera? So what the researchers did was decide we're going to put this on hold until we can anticipate what the problems are going to be. They developed a framework called ELSI. We want to know what the ethical, legal, and social issues are, how we can anticipate those proactively before we begin the project. So until those questions could be identified and addressed, the research was actually put on hold for a few years. And many people thought that was admirable. So, as I just mentioned, it was halted until those guidelines were in place. But the question that I would ask too, is that approach, or one similar to the LC model, is that really an improvement over traditional approaches to moral problems? Okay. And will that really help us to better understand and resolve ethical issues affecting emerging technologies? And specifically, would it really help us to better address issues with AMI and IoT? Should we halt all technologies in the future until we get all the ethics worked out? Many people have really praised the LC framework as the ideal model because it was proactive rather than reactive. But some philosophers, including Jim Moore and John Ruckert, have been critical of this ethics first approach, not just in the case of the Human Genome Project, but also just in general. So Moore and Ruckert have argued that the problem with that is really, it's two-pronged, the problem with ethics first approach. It depends on our knowledge, what they call the factual determination of the harms and benefits of the technology before an adequate ethical assessment can be done. And in the case of many, if not most emerging technologies, it's difficult to know what the future results of that technology will be in advance. So we can ask then, would this LC-like or ethics first model be best in the case of emerging technologies? And critics like Moore, Rucker, and others, argue that if we use that model, it might make sense, or seem to make sense, to put a moratorium on research until we get all the facts. And the problem with doing that, it would halt technological development, but wouldn't necessarily advance the ethics of it, because we don't know yet what that technology portends. So if an ethics first model is problematic, but it makes sense to turn back to the traditional ethics last kind of model. And again, some critics, including Moore and Rucker, argue that turning back is not desirable either, because once a new technology is in place, much of the harm's already been done, and it might be too late to really do a kind of reasonable ethical analysis. So it would seem that neither this ethics first nor ethics last type of model is ideal in the case of the context of emerging technologies. And I would argue, along with people like Jim Moore, John Ruck, and others, that ethics is not something static, but rather it's dynamic. It's constantly changing, it's evolving. And it's something that needs to be done continually, not after the fact, not before the fact, but continually as a new technology develops and as the consequences become better understood. The policies need to be revised. So we can't just do it at the end or in the beginning. It's got to be done continually. So it would seem the inadequate applied ethics model needs to be dynamic, because the factual component, which we don't know about yet, needs to be continually updated as that becomes clearer to us. So I noted earlier that when analyzing controversial ethical issues, philosophers often use what we call the standard applied ethics framework. And just to refresh you, it's those 3 steps to identify the particular controversial technology or practice, describe, try to clarify the concepts associated with it, and then thirdly, apply traditional moral theory, the deliberative process to reach some kind of position. So I would argue that we need a 4th step to this. And building on the insights of people like Moore and Rucker and others, we would need to update the ethical analysis by continuing to refine and revise the policies as necessary, especially as the factual data changes or as information about the potential social impacts become clearer to us. So we have this dynamic loop. It's not something that we just simply do at the outset and say, okay, can check off the ethics box, that's done. Or something we do after the fact, because by then things are already in place and the harm is done. But we need to do this in a kind of a continuous model. So expanding on that 3-pronged model to add this 4th component. So just a few concluding remarks. I focused on some ethical aspects tonight of emerging and converging technologies, with particular emphasis on ethical implications of ambient intelligence and the Internet of Things. In response to some challenges posed by those and other emerging technologies, I suggest that we expand what I call the standard applied ethics model. I'm not arguing we need a brand new ethical framework to address the challenges. Some people said, no, in light of these technology changes, we need a brand new ethics. People have made this argument, and I don't agree with it. I think it's overblown, it's not warranted. But some have made that argument. Throughout the old ethical system, we need to just revamp. We need to reconstitute it. So I believe that we should expand the standard ethics model by building on the insights of people like James Moore and John Rucker and others, and incorporate a dynamic ethics component, that 4th step, into the ethical framework. I also believe that the standard model can be expanded in other ways too, and for a whole host of reasons that we haven't even talked about tonight, but especially because of the kinds of issues that are arising now with AI. However, I'm not going to be able to talk about that tonight, elaborate on those concerns that could be in discussion, but it's beyond the scope of this talk, and it's something I've addressed elsewhere. So among the references tonight in tonight's talk, I mentioned people like Philip Bray and James Moore and others, John Weckert. So just a list of references, and we're excited. And thank you very much for your kind attention. So I'll turn it over for any questions and answers people might have.
I just invited everyone to unmute themselves before unmuting myself. You're all welcome to unmute yourself now and ask any questions or drop any questions into chat. Herman, could I ask you about something you mentioned in passing earlier? You referred to Shodan, and I had never heard of that. So I went online and I went to Shodan and I typed in webcam into the search field, and I got a list of webcams from around the world, and I clicked on one that turned out to be a webcam in Miami for a company called Mojo Host, and I suddenly felt like I was doing something very illegal. But I don't know what that is. I don't know how to read the data. I don't know what it is, but it kind of freaked me out to be doing that. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that is and what I just did?
Well,
is the FBI coming?
No. I think it's what I would call a dark search engine. I read an article a few years ago for Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I did something in the search engines, and the editor was good. I don't want you advertising for these people. I had to point the existence of this out, so I had the URL for it. No, it's not illegal, I guess. I don't know, like you, how to read some of the data, but there are enough efficient, especially savvy people out there who can do that. Some people have recommended. Have you ever heard of the search engine DuckDuckGo? Have you ever heard of that one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people really recommend using that for privacy, but I don't know what to say. I mean, you didn't do anything illegal as far as I'm concerned. But it's something ethically problematic.
It is. Yeah. It was surprising to me how uncomfortable I felt suddenly, with this perfectly public search engine. It described itself on the front page as the search engine for the Internet of Everything or something like that.
It's exactly what it is. But I mean, if you had a smart device in your automobile and they were able to get into that, and you've heard these stories before, but someone's searching, someone doesn't particularly like you or something that does a search, is able to figure out that you're the owner of that automobile. I mean, if you get into a smart device in there, it is, or in your smart home. I mean, of course, I'm thinking, maybe there are some safeguards. I don't know, but it's worrisome for me.
Yeah, it definitely, in the context of everything you were talking about, it was kind of sobering to me. It lent this kind of a more concrete, sobering quality to it.
Well, and what's scary too is, I mean, the Internet of Things is at the base of all the emerging technologies. They're just layered on top of this. So if I think of if I think of AI at one level, ambient intelligence here, Internet of Things, and they're core for everything. For most of the new emerging technologies are built or presume that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I'm thinking that freedom would be decreased, and this is going back to, you mentioned, and I wanted to get maybe specifics. What kind of searching into a person's smart home environment could be done? And I would think that would decrease your freedom if others can, hack into what's going on in your home. So I don't have a lot of these smart devices, so I'm not really sure. I'm paranoid, so this can be depressing. But yeah, I'm picturing a future where people can just hack into your washing machine and learn and maybe see into using cameras that are already in people's homes to be able to, and I think it can already be done, but if you could just talk about that a little bit.
First of all, you may be more prudent than paranoid, just to, at that point. But because I also worry about smart devices. And when I mentioned, that's a good, you made an interesting point too. When I was talking about freedom, I was thinking more in the context of ambient intelligence and also control of that. But I wasn't thinking about losing freedom. I was certainly losing control if someone can hack into your smart appliances. That's clearly the case. It's a tough one to call because, I mean, on the one hand, I'm on the road, right? And my intelligent refrigerator tells my Apple Watch, which I don't have, by the way, that I'm low on milk. And then some app on my smartphone says there's a sale for milk at the XYZ store. And I go, you know, and then so I go there, and then it communicates back with my intelligent cabinets and tells me I'm low on coffee filters. I mean, so there's all these conveniences I'm going to have, right? And I think they're conveniences that I might be hesitant to give up. I mean, it won't affect me. I'm not going to have these, but you know, my daughter's generation, that's probably a reality for them. So it's a trade-off. I mean, if it becomes such a nuisance, I mean, I guess though, I don't know. I mean, I imagine there'll be certain kind of individual firewalls you'll be able to put up to prevent people from outside. How you prevent showdown, for example, to get back to Jared's point from finding your device. Maybe there'll be ways of, maybe there are, I don't know, ways of doing that. But I think for the uninitiated, like ourselves, if we have a smart device and are on top of that, I think it's easy prey. It's just subject for a possible search. And yeah, I mean, it would reduce our freedom, certainly, and our safety, more than our freedom even, and control in general. So again, I worry about the ethical issues. I'm the point where I'm trying to identify and advocate for strong policies, because I think that's where it's going to get, that's where it comes down. So I think this dynamic ethics model, I think, would help us do that, because it says this is ongoing. It's evolving. It's fluid. You know, we need policies that are, I don't know, flexible enough and fluid enough to just and nimble to address these as things change. Because just as every time we'll get a fix that might ensure our privacy, there is some other fix on the technological part, or not, some other feature, I should say, is going to find a new way, either override the fix or find a new way into a smart device, smart home, smart apartment.
Sally, I have a question. So who has, you know, I kind of understand what you mean where we need policies based on ethics and things, but who has the authority to implement those kind of things, really? I mean, who's going to control Shodan and the next version of Shodan?
Yeah. There is no central control point. So in the US, it's mostly, we depend on the best practices of the corporations. I mean, if you compare the US to, say, the EU, European Union has very strict data protection policies. It's more centralized, it's more bureaucratic. Some might have a problem with that, I don't know. But on the other hand, and there's also, just from a cultural / natural point of view, a totally different starting point. So there the presumption is you have to opt in specifically to have this stuff, information gathered about you. In the US, it's just the opposite. We have to opt out, right? And one argument is, well, our corporations need to be flexible. They need to be able to be nimble. They can't be burdened by over-regulatory practices. On the other hand, US companies operating in Europe are able to comply with that. So I guess the one answer to your question is you have a strong federal unit in place of bureaucracy that monitors and controls and regulates some of those kinds of technologies. In the US, we depend on, Google being a good guy or Apple being a good guy. I think for the most part, maybe Google and Apple have a decent track record, but I'm suspicious of corporations. Like, I mean, look at Facebook, for example. I mean, they claim to have some ethical principles. I don't, I don't know. And what gets tricky there too is the way it seems to work in the U.S. is you have to sort of come at through liability. That seems to be, but that hasn't worked so well either.
Because then you're always reactive. It's already.
I think in the case of Facebook, that's clearly the case. It has been totally reactive. And
was there anything proactive in the Facebook thing? Was there anything, a priori put into place to do some of those protections?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Facebook, and so I have an account. I joined Facebook. I don't know, 12. I figure if I'm going to be writing about this, I should have an account and find out what's going on there. So I don't post anything, but I have an account on there. So I'm not what you call an ardent Facebook supporter or user. From what I've been able to gather is they have been only reactive, and it's only when things are brought to their attention, and they've apologized on occasion for, activities involving 2016 elections and so on, but they haven't come out and said, "Oh, we're going to." Well, they'll say, "Oh, we're going to do things better," but they haven't presented any kind of policies. They do have an ethics group, I guess, but that group is reporting to the corporation, so it's going to represent the interests of the corporation. And the federal government doesn't have an overarching board, a technology ethics board, which would be nice if they had. I don't see that happening, sadly, for some time, but that would be, there was at one time an office called the Office of Technology Assessment in DC, and it was really good, but it became, I guess, too politicized, or many conservative politicians saw it as a bad thing, and when it came time to cut budgets, that was one of the first things to go. It's too bad. I thought that was a good starting point for that. And so right now, it's mostly through the legal challenges that we're doing it, and it's too bad. I wish we, in some ways, could be a little more like Europe. I think we would all benefit from it, but entrepreneurs would see it very differently. At least American entrepreneurs.
Well, Herman, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you join us tonight.
No, I enjoy it. To me, it's a very important topic, so I always enjoy talking about it. So thank you.
And thank you all for coming. It was great to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was interesting.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.